Today, we're excited to welcome Matt Wissler to Mushrooms and Me. Matt is a psilocybin facilitator and instructor with Changa Institute's facilitator certification program in Oregon, and is helping to shape the first cohort of facilitators eligible for licensure in Colorado. With a fascinating background spanning endangered species recovery, teaching, crisis intervention, and more, Matt's approach to facilitation blends science and spirituality and a deep connection to nature. From his own transformative healing journey with ayahuasca to co-facilitating Oregon's second legal psilocybin facilitation session, Matt has incredible insights and experiences to share. So Matt, thank you so much for being here and welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly and Sam. I'm really happy to be here today.
Awesome.
We are too. So we're going to get right into the questions. First one, your professional background is so diverse: endangered species recovery, teaching, crisis intervention, and working with at-risk youth. How have these experiences shaped the way that you approach psilocybin facilitation?
Yeah, I mean, they've all helped inform who I am as a person. So really at the core of my facilitation practice, I'm reflected in that in my approach. But I have taken different aspects from those various experiences. And I guess maybe I'll just kind of go biographically. So the first sort of 10 to 12 years of my professional life, I was working mostly with endangered species monitoring and recovery projects. Some of that was field work and some of that was more hands-on at wildlife reserves and things like that. And the big things that I took away from those experiences was, first of all, just a real significant deepening of my appreciation for and just awe and admiration and respect for nature, just a real significant deepening of that connection. But in terms of facilitation work, I think especially working hands-on with a wide variety of animals, wildlife especially, so not domesticated, you learn a lot of skills in nonverbal communication, kind of being a calm sort of presence, trying to keep everybody, I'll refer to the animals as people, trying to keep everybody calm and relaxed while they may be in what is to them very stressful situations because they don't always understand what's going on and don't know that you really have their best intentions at heart. So that nonverbal communication, I think, is really critical when you get into a session. Vocalizing, if somebody's really deep in an experience, can be quite challenging. So just by the way they're moving or expressing themselves in that moment, it can really help with empathizing with and identifying kind of where they are, how they're feeling, those sorts of things. Maybe if a little bit of gentle support or something might be needed to be offered in that moment, just as is appropriate. The other thing I think it's really inspired in me is just this ability to connect with, or honed or strengthened, exercise this ability to connect with different forms of consciousness. So, I know a human on psilocybin is still a human consciousness having a psilocybin experience, but that's not the ordinary everyday state of human consciousness. So, as animals have their own forms of consciousness and their own perspectives, and that may overlap in a lot of ways with humans, it's also different in a lot of ways. Just as the human brain in the psychedelic state, a lot of similarities with everyday consciousness, but also a lot of differences. So I think just being able to kind of recognize, honor, and respect and navigate different beings in those different positions of consciousness has been really helpful. So
Cool.
yeah, after doing that for like 12 years, I don't really still kind of ask myself why once in a while, but I switched gears and I went back to university and got a postgraduate degree in education and did become a secondary school teacher. This was in New Zealand. So I went from working on a Kiwi recovery program down there to working in the classroom at a secondary school. And the classroom really wasn't a great fit for me. I did it for about 2.5 years before leaving. But some of the things that did really help with, one, the obvious, is with my instructor position with the Changa Institute. just in terms of putting together lesson plans and presenting information and those sorts of things. But I think a little less obvious was there's a lot of practice involved in staying kind of calm and grounded in what are often very chaotic and stressful situations. So there was a lot of practice in that. And I really appreciate having had those experiences, even if they didn't always seem enjoyable at the time. Yeah, and at the end of that 2.5 years, I left New Zealand, relocated back to North America, and that was when I started running work readiness programs for at-risk young adults, as well as a bit of crisis intervention. So it was with 3 different nonprofits, but I kind of lumped that whole period together. And that was about a 6 to 7 year period of my life. And really, honestly, that is just a practice in being the calm in other people's storms when you're doing crisis intervention. And that's really a lot of the skills, at least during the administration session, the important parts is just being that calm and that grounding presence, regardless of what kind of emotional turmoil the other person might be experiencing at that time. Aside from that, also just with the development side of working with at-risk young adults, there's some overlaps to that with the integration process. You want to take what was meaningful from the experience from the client and find ways to either act on that, or if it's just maybe a way that you view yourself or your situation in the world, those sorts of things. How do you reinforce that shift in perspective so that it has lasting, ongoing benefits? So just sort of developing these kind of growth plans and making sure that there are things that are, hopefully enjoyable and also achievable. You don't want to set people up for failure and then they get frustrated and just give up. So you find achievable steps that comes from the person's interest and their experience and what they're hoping to maintain in their lives, and just finding ways to kind of flush that out and develop it and reinforce that. So
I love to see how your varied background has really informed your practice. And you had mentioned the importance of nonverbal communication, and during our practicum for the facilitator training we went through, we noticed that the facilitator that we were watching, she changed her breathing technique, and that had a calming effect on the guy when he was having a more distressing period of his journey.
Yeah, really cueing into those nonverbal responses in a client. And then she used nonverbal back with him. Because I don't know about everybody, but for me, my hearing is very heightened when I'm on a journey. And so he could hear instantly that she started taking these big calming breaths. And so he lined his breathing up with hers. And it was just beautiful, actually, to witness.
No, it really is. And, that's something I talk about in preparation with all of my clients, because that sort of conscious breathing and connecting with breath, it's really simple. It's really basic. It's something we all do every day, all day, without even thinking about it, even in our sleep. But it's also one of the most kind of calming, grounding things that we can do. If you're stressed out about something, your body starts releasing adrenaline, your circulation picks up, your heart starts beating faster, all of that. And you take your focus to your breath, you slow that down. And in turn, that starts to slow down your heart rate, which slows down both the circulation and release of that adrenaline, and just really starts calming the entire system down. So what I quite often tell my clients is when I'm in an administrative session and a client is having their experience, I want to be as least disruptive to their process as possible. So one of the first steps I very well may take, if it seems like things are getting pretty intense for them, is just start breathing loudly myself, and just having that be a little cue to the person, hey, sounds like things are getting seems like things are getting pretty intense right now. Maybe we just take our attention to our breath and just breathe for a little while. And that often is actually all a person needs to go from verge of a nervous breakdown into maybe not having an easy time in their experience, but being able to manage their experience.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people who come into a journey with a lot of trauma and things they need to work through. And so I kind of want to tie that to something you had said earlier about your experience teaching and how you knew it wasn't for you, but that even though, and I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but it wasn't a period of time in life you felt like was really for you. You were still very grateful for that experience. And I think a lot of times in a journey, we have those same experiences even when we go through those challenges or difficult moments in our journey, things that are popping up that we're kind of facing and whatnot. Most people, almost every person, statistically speaking, that's reported says that something good has come from that. And so it sounds like, not only experiences you could write about on a resume, but your personal, the way you've like lived out your experience and walked with other people really would create a sense of safety in the space with them. And it sounds like you could probably work with people who have a lot of heavy, trauma and things.
A
And
lot of people who come for these services do. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And, that's a lot doing the crisis intervention work, of course, and at-risk young people. They all come with their own sets of history. And oftentimes they're in those situations because that history is, filled with trauma or really difficult situations and challenges. And it's just, people often carry all of these things around and they don't know what to do with it. So it's finding, a healthy and productive way where they can release and let go and put some of those things down. And that doesn't mean you necessarily forget. I mean, we never forget, but you can come to look at things from a different perspective, or have a sense of acceptance, or take away the power that these past events have over your current modes of thought and living. And that's really where the benefit of a lot of these experiences come in. And some people do have beautiful, enjoyable, like fantastic experiences that they get a lot out of and greatly benefit from. And some people have really difficult, challenging experiences that quite often they more positive things away from than the like really easy, enjoyable, experiences. So that's the whole debate about like what really constitutes a bad trip. You hear that a lot, and a lot of people say they're afraid of having a bad trip. And it's, well, the experience may be very challenging and it may be unpleasant, but you were talking about the studies done on this. They did a big survey, so it's not really like scientific, except it was very large. And in that, they found, 10% of people reported having what was described as a quote unquote bad trip. But in that subset of 10%, 90% of those people said they gained positive benefits out of that experience. So when I look at that, it just tells me that, it's only 10% of 10%, which is what, 1%? So only 1% of people and experiences actually have something that I would consider a bad trip. And that's an experience that's really challenging and you don't feel like you gained anything moving forward from.
right.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from also the preparation process. I know you touched a little bit on administration and then the importance of integration, but there is a whole entire preparation step as well, which helps people feel that sense of, well, I'll kind of let you, talk about preparation a little bit and what that
Yeah.
looks like for you and for you know.
No, absolutely. There is a process that we go through with clients, and it starts from the very first conversation, the consultation. And, so there's consultation, preparation, the administration day, and then the integration process. And when I try to identify what step in that process is kind of most important, I have real problems with that because they are all very important in their own individual ways, right? So the preparation process is all about, well, the consultation, just starting there, that's really about connecting with the individual. So connecting with the client, developing a relationship, having them feel a sense of comfort with you. They are going to be in a very vulnerable position when they are in that session. So if they aren't comfortable with you and don't have trust in you as a facilitator, then how are you really going to be able to effectively support them when they are in that experience? So that's really step one, establishing the relationship. And then the preparation process is really, a lot of us come to us in this kind of formal legal framework because they don't have any experience with psychedelics. And so they have no idea what to expect and what the experience is going to be like. So it really is just kind of preparing them as best as we can. And it is a little challenging because the experience itself is so ineffable. It's so indescribable. It's really difficult to put into words. And yeah, so one of the things I'll sometimes say to clients is like, well, the one thing I can promise you is that things are going to get weird.
Yeah,
And, and then typically the clients I say that to at some point during their experience, they'll just go, man, this is so weird. Yep, absolutely. That's probably the only real way in this day-to-day language that we have that we can really describe it. But still having them have some ideas of the types of things that can come up and what to expect, and really just having a clear picture of how the day is going to flow and what to expect from the time they arrive at the service center until, they get back to where they're staying that night. And even beyond that, that can all be really comforting and also just enable the client to focus on their experience and their intentions. And that's another part is, with psychedelics, we talk about set and settings for the experience. And the setting, of course, is like the administration room and the atmosphere, music, things like that. But the set is the mindset that people are coming in with. And so another really important part of that preparation process is, if you mention intentions to somebody who's never done this type of work before, they'll be like, what do you mean intentions? What's that? So really helping them with the why are you doing this? What are you hoping to get out of it? What are your main goals? And setting them up to explore that in a decent amount of depth beforehand, but not only exploring that in a decent amount of depth, but also once they've explored it, like narrowing that down to maybe like a 3 to 5 word mantra or something like that that's easy to remember, that you can hold on to when you're in the experience if you need to. Because this big nebulous concept may be really hard to connect with in the experience. But if you have put the work in and summarized all of that in this small handful of words, that can be easy to connect with. And just because it's a small handful of words doesn't mean that connection to this big nebulous concept isn't there. The important part, and I feel like I'm kind of now in a prep session, so I'll cut it short, but the important part of all of that as well, though, is once the experience starts, like once you drink that tea, just let go of those intentions and let the experience unfold. If you've put the work into exploring those and nailing that down, that's all going to be with you, whether you pay attention to it or not. And I'll often say, like, your intention might be something that's sitting over here, and the experience might feel like it's going off in this direction. And if you sit there and wrestle with it and try to force it to go over there, a lot of times it's going to be a lot less productive than if you just let it flow and unfold. And if you do let it flow and unfold, what you might find is, it goes off over here and then circles around and ducks and weaves and does all these other things, and then eventually hits your intentions. And when it does, what you might realize is like, oh, there are all these different points along the way that I had to connect in order to get to the insight that really meets my intentions. So if you actually struggle with that and try to force it just directly straight to it, then you might actually be hampering the process, and you might actually not get as much out of it. So there's tons of little nuances like that we discuss in preparation. And so that's really just all about giving clients the tools to navigate the experience, having them feel comfortable with what to expect and what is going to happen, and giving them tools to maximize the benefits from that.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing so much about the preparation process. And you talked about that really big study that happened back in the day where there was a ton of self-reporting. Some of those cases that ended up being bad trips, people were using other drugs while they were using psychedelics. They were, doing it in a party setting, like completely different ways of doing things. And what you just described about the prep process really helps. And I got an email this morning gave us an update on the number of facilitations that have happened in Oregon. It's 8,500 plus legal facilitations have happened, and 0.15% has resulted in challenging experience. EMS needed to be called. So a 0.1%, which is pretty great. So going from 10% where people are self-reporting and in a variety of ways that they were experiencing psychedelics to how we're actually doing things in Oregon is like 100 times better results.
Well, and that's the entire reason why we're using this framework, where you have, trained, hopefully experienced, licensed facilitators who are helping support you through every step of that process. It's really about, not maximizing benefits. Yes, absolutely. But also just harm and risk reduction and ensuring that people are safe and that there is aftercare available if it's needed. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Let's turn our attention to the science side. You like science. People, they really want to know what's going on in their head when they take a psychedelic. So with your background, can you help our listeners understand how psychedelics interact with the brain? Talking about the serotonin receptors, the default mode network, neuroplasticity, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So when I taught, I was a science biology teacher. And of course, I studied a lot of that to do the wildlife work that I was doing. And I'm just going to first start by saying that a lot of the mechanisms of how this works, we still don't fully understand. Research into this has been really hampered through the Controlled Substance Act. And so it's really only been maybe the last 10 years or so that they've started up with a lot of this research again. But not only that, we've made wonderful technological advances with imagery and all of those things. But at the same time, our brain forms structures in like 13 different dimensions. And we're using 3-dimensional technology to look at these 13-dimensional structures. So we're only getting, a fraction of the picture, even when we're looking at those things. So in terms of like, can I lay out how it actually all works? Nobody really can at this point. But what I can say is that absolutely. So you consume a mushroom, that mushroom contains psilocybin, maybe some psilocin. Psilocin is what psilocybin is converted into in the body. That's actually the agonist on those serotonin receptors, so the 5-HT2A receptors. The mushroom itself, quite a lot of them contain various levels of other tryptamine derivatives. There's like baeocystin or norbaeocystin and quite a few others. And they are all structurally very similar. They're all part of this like tryptamine group, and they are all 5 agonists. So that's where like we talk about the entourage effect. And in clinical trials, I think it's worth noting that they give people synthetic psilocybin, COMP360, that is what they're using. And that synthetic psilocybin is less potent and less effective. It seems contrary because you're like, oh, synthetic, it's pure and it's going to be great, hit you like a ton of bricks. But it's actually less potent and less effective than the whole mushroom, I should say, because the whole mushroom contains this whole host of chemicals that all may act on our systems in complementary ways. And that's something that I think they've only run one trial comparing the synthetic stuff with the natural stuff, but they did find the natural to be more beneficial. And just anecdotally, working with a lot of clients who are on serotonergic antidepressants like SSRIs, SNRIs, things like that, going with strains that have low potency in terms of psilocybin, maybe higher potency in terms of a lot of these other compounds. So you're kind of balancing out the amount of each that they're getting. And also they're taking more material because it's a lower potency. So if you want to take 25 milligrams of psilocybin in this whole fungal form, if it's a low potency strain, maybe you need to take 5 or 6 grams to get up to that. Whereas a high potency strain, you might only need to take like 1.5 grams or something. And so you're also just getting a lot more of those other tryptamines when you do that as well. And personally, I found that to be a lot more effective with clients who are on those antidepressants. But one of the really interesting things, and this is very new kind of cutting edge research that they found, is they actually identified that we have more, perhaps significantly more 5-HT2A receptors inside of our neurons, not just on the cell membranes on the surface. And what is really fascinating about that is that serotonin cannot cross a cellular membrane. So serotonin itself can only interact with the receptors that are on the surface. But these 5-H2 A receptors that are inside the cells, they tend to be grouped around the Golgi complex, and psychedelics can cross that cellular membrane and interact with those intracellular receptors, so the ones that are inside. So they're starting to think that perhaps that's why like the neuroplasticity and things like that occur when we take these psychedelics or these entheogens, compared to, just our body's natural serotonin that's produced interacting with these receptors. We have a normal state of consciousness when that's happening. So I just find that really fascinating. And it also, to me, indicates that there's some benefit to having at least occasional exposure to various entheogens, various psychedelics. And a lot of psychonauts out there might be familiar with like the stoned ape hypothesis, Terence McKenna's thing, but I just look at this as further evidence of that. And basically the theory behind that is, way back early in human development, that we may have been accidentally or perhaps deliberately ingesting some of these things, especially mushrooms that contain psilocybin, and that could have led to a lot of our sort of higher development in things that we consider like that make us human, like speech for one. Like, what is speech? You're using sound to represent, in a lot of cases, an object. And so what is that but analogous to synesthesia? And so how would that come about developing? Well, perhaps exposure to these compounds might have helped move that along, as well as just social development, community development, all music, all of these fantastic things. We don't know, we don't have a time machine, but to me, it's just, well, we have these receptors inside of our cells. Our body is likely still producing them for a reason, or else evolutionarily, they probably would have gone by the wayside by now. And the fact that psychedelics, including psilocybin, are some of the only things that we know of that can interact with them, then that just really points to, yeah, there is benefit in these substances, and nature itself intends us to at least occasionally be exposed to these things, and that there is benefit to being exposed to these things.
Absolutely. And I do think that the stoned ape hypothesis is interesting. And if we think about that same concept and how psychedelics affect our brains now, it's all like a matter of that neuroplasticity, which is our brain's ability to regenerate, to grow, to, you can reprogram behavior patterns and thought patterns that you currently have. Like our brain already experiences neuroplasticity, but with psychedelics, it actually, there's science suggests that we enter a heightened period of neuroplasticity where we're doing it a bit faster than we would normally be doing it after certain psychedelic experiences.
Absolutely.
And I think it's really kind of a monumental. That's why integration is so important, because you're learning these healing practices and your brain is accepting them and to the new messaging that you are working on sharing with it, and you begin to believe things much faster. And I remember after, it's only been a year since I started journeying, and after my very first experience, I very quickly wasn't triggered by the things I used to be triggered by. And I didn't expect that. You hear a lot of people's stories, you hear about the science and all the things that tell you that improvement will happen, but somehow you still don't really believe it will happen to you. You just kind of hope it will. And the SSRIs aren't helpful, and for a lot of people, and talk therapy just can't get it quite there, on its own, that sort of thing. And so you give journeying a shot and realize that I guess I'm a human like every other human, and the science works.
Yeah, and there's so many things that were kind of that sort of came up that I think are absolutely worth talking about when you're going through that. I won't talk about all of them, but I will just say absolutely. Like, so the final thing that I'll share about the science, and you describe some of this yourself, is that we have this default mode network, and the default mode network is just the typical patterns and ways that our brain function. And on sort of a conscious level, this is how we view ourselves and our place in the world, how we view past experiences that have happened to us, how we view our relationships, all of that. So our egos are completely tied up in our default mode network. And one of the things that psilocybin or entheogens in general do is really dampens down the grasp that has on us. So you can really break out of these old habitual thought processes. You know, rumination for people with depression or trauma, things like that, is huge. You just keep walking these same pathways that lead in a circle over and over and keep you stuck in these ways of viewing yourself or life, things like that. And one of the things that psilocybin does is disconnects you from that. And when people talk about things like an ego death is just the most extreme version of that disconnect from your default mode network, where perhaps for a short period of time, you lose almost all concept of just who you are as a person and your place in the world. And what can be really beneficial with that disconnect, whether it's just a weakening of that grasp or a full disconnect, is it really does give you an opportunity to kind of take everything off the shelves, clean the shelves off, and put it all back in a nice, neat new order, you know?
Yeah.
And if you come to some aspect of your experience that gives you new insight into your situation or ways of thinking about things, viewing yourself, then you're going to break that old cyclic default mode and establish a new connection, a new way of thinking that's reflective of that new insight. So where integration becomes really important is, I'll use the analogy of, you know, it's like you go out into the jungle and what you've been doing is walking the same trail over and over through the jungle. So the trail's really well worn and it's really well established. It's just easy to walk. And what you're doing out of this experience with that new connection is you're taking a machete and you're hacking a new path through the jungle. And if you've ever been to a jungle, you'll probably know that, you know, you can hack a path through the jungle, but if you don't keep walking that and maintain that trail, it's going to grow over again really quickly. So that integration, the integration part of the process is where we go out to and do the work to keep that trail established and maintained. If it's beneficial, then you want to make that new trail your new way of thinking about things, viewing things, or use the analogy of getting from here to there. And that really does take some conscious effort in wearing that trail down and establishing that as a habitual thought process, basically. And that's a lot of the integration work. Absolutely. I do think it's worth pointing out that, you know, nature connectivity actually really reinforces these new neural networks. It doesn't create them, but the synergistic effect between nature and entheogens, psychedelics, is that the entheogen may establish a new neural pathway, a new thought process. And they have found that taking time to really be present in nature and to appreciate it actually strengthens those new neural connections, whether you're consciously working on that or not. So there is some real fantastic synergistic effect. As far as neuroplasticity, I don't know, can I tell a story really quickly about a client? Yeah, so I had a client, this was shortly after I first started practicing, and she had a traumatic brain injury. And in our preparation, she actually did a fantastic job of preparing me for what may come up during the experience as a result of this traumatic brain injury. And she said, well, sometimes I have an episode that manifests in seizure-like symptoms. It's not exactly the same as a seizure, but it looks like a seizure. And when this happens, I can't talk. And I get frustrated because I can't talk. And then I start crying because I'm frustrated that I can't speak. And so when we got to her session, it was a pretty low dose, of course, you know, being gentle. but those seizure-like symptoms started to manifest. And she actually had them throughout almost the entire course of the session. But what we found that was really fascinating was instead of not being able to talk, she was actually able to talk almost normally throughout the entire experience.
Wow.
So her brain had obviously found some kind of workaround that it wasn't able to access previous to that. And coming out of that session, it was really difficult for her because those seizure-like symptoms are not enjoyable and caused a slew of other things like dizziness and nausea and all of that. So it wasn't an easy experience, but she did say, I feel like my brain is healing. I feel like I've made a lot of progress. And this is something that I really feel like I should continue doing, whether it's once every 3 months or something along those lines, because the benefits were significant enough. Yeah. And I just, it just shows the strength, the healing potential of not just these medicines, but also just our own intrinsic ability to heal and adapt and things like that. So if this can be a catalyst for those positive changes and these healing occurrences, then absolutely, I think we'd be fools to not try to take advantage of that.
It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story. I find that when we have a really good session with a client, like I feel grateful to be just be a part of that experience.
Oh, absolutely. Every time I have a session at some point, I'm just still blown away by the fact that I have the opportunity to do this work. I do feel very honored and privileged in a lot of ways, just from the fact that I live where I do and it's legal and I can do this above board. And I don't take any part of that for granted. It really is an honor to be able to do this.
Yeah,
I agree.
that's great. I'd like to turn our attention away for a few minutes from mushrooms and get a little more personal, so we know a little bit about your story. And we'd like you to just share about your journey with ayahuasca and how that began after losing a loved one who was terminally ill, and then let's bring that back to, that healing process and how it influences the work you do today.
Yeah, well, I can kind of wrap a few things up in this because it's also a big part of my story from going from entheogen psychedelic enthusiast into being a facilitator. Because I, had throughout my adult life had a real interest in psychedelics and had a lot of occasional intentional use, sometimes perhaps not as intentional, but a lot of it initially was to deepen and foster this nature connectivity that was really important to me. And most of my experiences were like go on a backpacking trip and get way out there and maybe eat some mushrooms with a friend one of the nights while we're camped out in the backcountry, like that sort of thing. And about 8 years or so ago now, I did have a very old dear friend who had become a partner of mine. So we were actually only together like as a couple for somewhere between 2 and 3 years. But I had, known her for more of my life than I hadn't known her, and one of my best friends. So really very near and dear to me. And she did become terminally ill and passed away. And it was kind of a long process and a very difficult process. And not just going through that process with her was challenging, but it also actually brought up kind of a lot of drama within our friend group and our wider community. So dealing with a lot of that was actually really difficult. So as you can imagine, going through this, I spent some time in therapy. And after several months in therapy, my therapist actually said to me, like, you're doing great. Like, you're doing all the right stuff. You know all of the things. And I don't know if you're actually going to keep finding a lot of benefit coming here. And she was right. Like, intellectually, I knew all the right stuff. And I was getting involved in the community and building new relationships as well. And like, there was a lot of really positive things happening in my life at that time, but I just really wasn't feeling it. And The interesting part is I had become friends with somebody who did host ceremonies with ayahuasca. And I sat in one ceremony with him. That was my first experience working with ayahuasca. And honestly, at the time, there was all that stuff with my partner, and it was also a period where there was a lot of stuff going on at work. And I actually, that very day I sat in that ceremony, I'd kind of been quick fired from the job I was in. And I won't go into too much detail because this is public and you can find my work background and all of that. But let's just say I was in a really difficult period where like almost every aspect of my life just felt like a fight. You know, I'd been fighting with hospitals and staff and other institutions to try to get my partner the care she needed, and fighting with, you know, friends who were misunderstanding the situation, and fighting with employers over some unfortunate circumstances that had happened there. And so when I showed up for this ceremony, I told my friend, like, you know, I explained to him what had happened earlier that day with my job and all of that. And I was just like, I really don't know if I'm in a good headspace for this. And he just looked at me and he was like, well, you do what feels right to you. But I'm just going to put it out there that maybe now is the right time to do this. And so when we went in and sat down, he still prepared a dose for me and kind of left it up to me whether I wanted to take it or not. And I kind of was just like, oh, screw it, I'm going to take it. So, so I drank it down. And really what ended up happening was it was just like hours of what I can only describe as like basking in God's light. If you described God's light as nothing but unconditional love, understanding, and acceptance. And at that moment, it was like really just what I really needed, because my life was so devoid of love, understanding, and acceptance in that moment, that it was really deeply helpful to just be reminded that like that was still a unifying force in the universe and was ever present, whether it feels like it or not in your given set of circumstances. So moving on from that, I then had an interest in ayahuasca, and I was debating about, you know, kind of back of my mind, sort of toying with this thought of maybe I should go to the Amazon and like work with some indigenous people in a traditional setting. And I, you know, as a wildlife ecologist kind of guy, I'd love to go to the Amazon anyway, check that out. But then there was a period where the same thing, like the same place in the Amazon and the same things with ayahuasca just kept coming up again over and over and over, like almost where it was almost every day. And it would not be things that I was deliberately looking for. Like maybe I would read an article that was kind of tied with psychedelics, but they would specifically mention this thing, or listening to a podcast that, again, maybe about psychedelics, but really specifically mentioning like this one place again, you know, and it just kept coming up over and over. And I was like, this is getting to be too much. Like, I think this is where I need to go. And I think now is the time I need to do this. So I made a plan and I made it happen. And I spent about 3 months in the Amazon. Only maybe about 6 weeks of that was actually working with ayahuasca. I was sitting in a ceremony about once every 3 days. But what really blew me away was that by the end of my third ceremony, I really felt like I had gained at least 90% of what I was hoping to get out of my entire time there. And what it really did for me was took these things that like I already kind of knew on an intellectual level, but really just wasn't working for me. Like I wasn't feeling it, you know? And it really took that from an intellectual knowing into an embodied knowing, where I was truly feeling that. And oddly enough, well, maybe not oddly, but early on, it hasn't happened as much lately, but very early in my facilitation practice, I did have a lot of clients who would come out of their experience, and towards the end of their session, they would look at me and they would say, you know, that was really challenging. And I don't know if I got anything out of that that wasn't something I don't already know. And they would seem kind of disappointed by that. And I would say, okay, well, here's all the aftercare stuff. I'm going to check in and like we'll do your first integration session about 3 days from now. I think that's a really good period because people do need a bit of time just to process and start piecing the experience together and making sense out of it. And what do I want to take away from this? Those kinds of questions. And 3 days later, though, when we would have our integration sessions, almost universally, their kind of take on the experience would change from disappointment to, well, now what I realize is that even though what I got out of that experience wasn't something I didn't already know, I feel like I'm embodying that truth a lot more than I used to. And it's really impacting the way I see myself, my loved ones, my place in the world. And for me, it's like, there's no mystery there, right? Like you honestly, if there's like a deep inner truth that you're not necessarily in alignment with in one way, shape, or form, that deep inner truth most likely isn't going to be a mystery. You will most likely know what that is. And what entheogens, psilocybin tend to do is just really connect people with that deep inner truth and kind of give you a bit of a wake-up call. Like, hey, you know this, but in one way, shape, or form, you're not embodying this. Like, let's make that happen, And that's that inner healing wisdom or your higher self, however you want to phrase that these substances most often connect people with. I mean, that's the term entheogen, which is the umbrella term for a lot mostly naturally derived psychedelics that tend to be used in kind of traditional ceremonial settings. But that term entheogen is rooted in Greek for, God within. So it's really something that helps connect you with your highest self and your own internal wisdom. Yeah, well, there's tons of benefits to be gained from that. I don't really know if I answered the question. I kind of got so sidetracked.
You did beautifully and then some. And yeah, no, I love hearing what comes from your heart and your head and how these things come together. Like you
Yeah,
really have.
it was my path to facilitation. So I will just finish by saying that when I left, you might have noticed that when I left the Amazon, all of these fields that I've worked in, there's this trend of trying to promote growth or healing in the world in one way, shape, or form, whether it's the human world or the natural world. So facilitation really started to seem like a really positive next step along that process. And I did start laying out the groundwork for what I would have to do to be able to facilitate in the Amazon. And it was going to be a bit of a long process. But shortly after kind of laying out what that path would look like and starting to work on making that happen, COVID-19 hit, shut everything down, all the borders down. But fortunately, shortly after Measure 109 was passed here in Oregon. So I just thought, here's a chance to do very similar work in the context of my own community, which actually seems more vitally important. So jumped on it and haven't looked back since.
Spirituality seems to play such a central role in your life and practice. How has it shaped the way that you've approached facilitation and lived day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just say a little bit more personal disclosure is that my father and brother are both Episcopalian priests. And so I was brought up with religion as just part of my day-to-day life. I did shy away from the church when I was about 12 years old. I kind of stopped going and rebelled and all of that. The main issue for me wasn't that, well, first of all, I just thought it was boring and I was a kid interested in doing boring things. But the other aspect of that was it wasn't necessarily an issue with like faith or religion in general, but I just really had a hard time with the concept that like your connection with a higher power, spirit, what is source, whatever you want to call it, that connection had to come through somebody else and an organization like the church, or even just the fact that you had to go, like that the church was God's house. And it's like, look at the world. We're living in this is all God's house, right? And so like, I did kind of detach from that, and later, as I got really interested in the wildlife things and all of that, kind of became more of an animist, and I'm just really not into hierarchical views of the world. And I'm really thankful that science is starting to catch up with a lot of this as well, in that it used to be like animals are all instinct and this and that and the other. And it's like, no, we can see that they have very rich emotional and intellectual lives. Sure, their views are different from ours, and the way they perceive and the way they think about things is different from us, but that doesn't mean that it's any lesser than. It's just different than. It suits their mode of living, right? And that's like the idea of evolution isn't, I don't see it as like, oh, you're evolving to be at the top of this pyramid. It's like, no, you're evolving to be able to survive well in today's environment. And so anything that is currently surviving well in today's environment, that's all at the top of that evolutionary pyramid, right? The stuff that isn't is the stuff that's dead and buried in the ground. So, there was a puzzle thing that I saw recently where it was showing ants trying to manipulate this object through a couple of walls and all that. And they put the side by side of a group of ants trying to carry this thing back to the nest, and a group of people trying to maneuver it through. And the funny thing is that the path and the problem solving and everything that this group of ants go through and the group of humans go through when you play it side by side, it's exactly the same. Exactly. And so, yeah.
Awesome.
And so honestly, I just really look at like spirit is everywhere. It's a part of everything. That there may be a greater unifying source, that sort of thing, that some people refer to as God. But whatever that is, personally don't have any doubt that it's there. As a facilitator, I honestly work within the framework of whatever my client is bringing to the table. So I do also have this science background, and if my client is atheist or agnostic or any of that, my job isn't to try to convert them to anything and make them see the world through my eyes. My job is to support them within their existing worldview through this process. And they may very well, through the process, come to think that there is more to life and the universe and all of that, but it's a little bit beside the point. So with those clients, I'll tend to draw on like my scientific background and all of that. We'll talk about the neurology and the default mode network and all of those things. And if somebody comes to me with really powerful, significant religious or spiritual beliefs, then maybe we lean a bit more towards those. I actually don't look at science and religion as contradictory at all. I just think science is a tool that we use to try to understand the world around us, and especially material aspects of the world around us, and how that works. And it is a fantastic tool, but it does neglect a lot of things. And I don't know if readers are kind of interested in the science spirituality thing. I think Rupert Sheldrake's work is fantastic. You can go ahead and look him up. He bridges or attempts to bridge a lot of those gaps. I'm a big fan of his, but I just don't think the two are incompatible in any way, shape, or form. And I'm happy to work with whatever framework a person brings to the table. Honestly, I talk about animism, but I also, I have a lot of respect for like Quaker belief systems where it's, everybody contains a part of God or is a part of God. And therefore, who am I to speak about God's truth above you or any other person? Because we are equally a part of that thing. And so all of our truths may be representing or are representing some aspect of this thing that's too great to be contained in any one belief system, And so at the heart of it, really, I just think pretty much all religions are all pointing at the same thing. And where they differ, that tends to be all the dogma that people have piled on top for control or societal norms or those sorts of things, but they aren't necessarily reflective of that greater source itself or history, viewing what happened in some group of people's history 2,000 years ago through the lens of their belief system And all of that got written down maybe 200 years later by another person drawing on the myth and legend of these events. And then that ends up as, well, this is God's word. This is like, you have to take this serious. Well, not have to take it seriously, but this is truth, And it's like, yeah, there is truth and wisdom in there, but is what you're saying, God's will in that moment is that really God's will, or is that, the people who are interpreting their viewpoint on history and their belief system and connection with spirit, are they mashing that all together and then looking at it at a 200-year-old reflective lens before they even write it down? So there's just a lot of questions there. Yeah.
And I appreciate how client focused or person focused you are in the work that you're doing. And, we're hitting the top of the hour. And so thinking about all these people from varied backgrounds, entrenched beliefs, just going about their lives, and they're thinking about trying psychedelics for the first time. What do you want them to know that maybe they have a misconception about, or maybe they just don't know anything about at all? What can we share with them as they think about taking on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I get questions from people who are, we'll just say, psychedelically naive all the time before they come in to a journey. And I'm trying to rack my brain for a second and think of like, what's the most common question or misconception? And I don't know if there is one that is the most common. I guess really the biggest thing that I would like to dispel is this idea that it's a quick or an easy fix. You can make huge leaps in progress and healing and those sorts of things through the utilization of these substances. But like we talked about integration earlier, I have had clients who come out of their experience and there's like, they had just had this very profound experience and they feel a lot better in one way, shape, or form. And there's this kind of afterglow period that we talk about. And so they come out of the experience and they're like, that was really helpful and I feel fantastic and my depression or whatever is gone and I don't need to do all of this stuff because I'm better now. And inevitably, every single one of those people, when I talk to them again 3 weeks or a month later, their response then becomes, well, yeah, I felt better for like a week and then it just started fading away. And now I feel like I'm getting back to where I was before I had this experience. And then I'll ask them about all the integration stuff that we talk about. Well, did you do this? And have you been doing this practice? And it's no. And so, yeah, so what I would really like to dispel is just this idea that it is a quick and easy fix, because you do have to, I don't want to call it work, because most oftentimes the things that are part of the integration process are things that people want to do anyway, and they've just been having trouble getting motivated to do it or feel like they should do, and they're having trouble being disciplined in doing it. And so but really just taking it seriously and putting in that work. And that's really where the long-term sustained benefits come in. Yeah, I mean, people generally, when they come to these sessions, they're oftentimes traveling from a long ways away. There is a financial aspect to it as well. So they are putting some money out to have these experiences. And just time, time off of work and time away from friends or whatever's going on back home. So you're already investing so much into it, and to sort of let go of the benefit side just because you're looking for that short-term easy fix and not doing the carry-ons afterwards and having it kind of fall apart because of that just seems like they're doing themselves a great disservice. So, yeah, so I would just say take the process seriously, every aspect of the process. Find a facilitator you connect with, and, that's fantastic to put your own kind of personal touches on the experience and things like that as well. But at the same time, also listen to your facilitator. They've been doing this, especially if they've been doing it for a while. They have gone through this process with a lot of people, and some of the things they may suggest may sound a little bit funny or weird or something at first, but honestly, it is going to be beneficial. Just along that, I'll just say a small thing, but it's been coming up a lot lately, is I tend to be pretty flexible in my music playlists. And, if clients send me music like a bit and mix it in with the playlist, that works really well. But lately, I've had quite a few clients who just wanted to make their own playlist. And I've had clients that worked okay with in the past, but lately what's been happening is they put on their playlist, an hour and a half in, they look at me and say, "Can you turn this off?" And I go, "Yeah, okay." And I stop it, and then we'll sit in quiet for a while. And then maybe after a while, I'll say, "You mind if I try putting something on?" And they'll say, "Yeah, go ahead." And then I'll put on things that feel appropriate from like my session playlist. And then they just go with it for the rest of the session. And at the end, they're like, "Wow, that like this song was so powerful, and that was so powerful, and this and that." And it's like, yeah, like big dramatic classical music is great now and then, but if that's all you're listening to, that like the power of that drama is going to wear off pretty quickly. Or, if what you're doing is making like a psychedelic rock playlist, well, music that might sound psychedelic when you're not on psychedelics may not actually be the best music when you are actually on psychedelics. It reminds,
agree with that one.
yeah, it reminds us of it, but it's not it, So yeah, that's just one small example, but it's like, yeah, your facilitator's been around the block with this. Just give them a listen. Yeah.
Sure. I appreciate what you said about the music and the fact that you touched so much on the importance of integration. It's not lost on Holly and I. We're super passionate about it. We wrote an integration journal just because of how important it is. But I would like to, we don't want to let people, or we don't want to end this session with people not knowing how to get a hold of you, because it's clear that you're super passionate. You've helped a ton of people, and there's probably people who could really benefit from being able to get a hold of you. So what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. My email is a fantastic way to get a hold of me. The best one to use would be mwissler@proton.me. I'll spell it out. So MWISSLER at proton, PROTON.me. And I also have a website. It's Psilocybin Services, but services is just SVCS.com. So PSILOCYBIN SVCS is how you would spell that.com. Or conversely, when I go to my website, sometimes I just Google myself. So you can Google Matthew Wissler, Psilocybin Facilitator, and my website should pretty much be the first thing that comes up. And you can contact me through my website as well.
That's great.
Well, thank you so much for just all of your wisdom and your knowledge and your spirit and your personal experience and everything that you brought up today and that you shared. And I really think that I feel really moved by a lot of what you shared, and I think the listeners will too. And so I just really appreciate you very, very much.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
No, thank you very much for having me on. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to both of you and hopefully really connect with some members of your audience as well.